There was a certain king who had a daughter who he loved very, very dearly. And even though he was, like all kings, busy with the affairs of state and his kingdom, he would spend time with his daughter, regaling her with stories. He told her fairy tales and folk tales and myths and legends. But she had a favorite story, and she would oftentimes say to her father, "Father, please tell me the story of the shofars." And he would repeat the story again. Now, whenever he could, he took his daughter with him on whatever affair that he had duties. And there was an occasion when they were returning from a certain duty that their carriage came to a bridge, and the wheels of the carriage got caught in the boards of the bridge, and when the horses tried to release it, the carriage turned over, tossing the king out onto the bridge and tossing his daughter over the edge of the bridge into the running water of the river below. She was carried away by the strength of the river's power. The king sent all his soldiers out to try to find his daughter, but to no avail. They scoured the river's edges, but they could not find her. The king was bereft. He went into a deep state of depression. He could not be brought out of this terrible state of loss. But as it so happened, the princess was carried down the river and tossed up on the edge when the river reached a bend. But, not remembering who she was, she dragged herself off to find a place where she could be out of the elements, and she found a cave. Now it so happened, this cave was the den of a group of thieves. And when they came back from their latest heist and entered the cave, they heard the sad sound of sobbing and whining. And when they looked, they found the limp body of the little girl. They took care of her. They asked her who she was, but she couldn't remember. But they tended her and adopted her, and she grew. But there were times when the thieves would go into town, and they would take the little girl with her, and they made her somewhat of a decoy when they were picking pockets or making a heist. But the little princess would sometimes come to the palace gates, and she would look in longingly and say, "Oh, I wish I could meet the king." And the thieves would say to her, "Oh, you silly girl, how can you imagine? You think you're some kind of princess?" But the king could not be consoled. His advisors tried everything to bring him out of the great sadness that hung over him. They tried everything. They bought jugglers, they bought musicians, and then someone remembered that the king loved to tell stories, so they thought that they could have a storytelling competition to entertain him. So word was sent out far and wide for storytellers to come to the palace. Now when the young maiden heard of this, as it so happened, she remembered the stories, even though she couldn't remember who she was. She said, I'm going to enter that competition. I'm going to tell story to the king. And so she practiced. She went out into the forest and she practiced her story over and over again. She practiced and practiced the words of her story. And the day came for the competition. And she went to the palace even though the thieves were laughing at her. But when it came to her turn to tell her story, she mumbled and stumbled and and the words wouldn't come out. And everyone grew impatient and said, get her away, send her away. And so very saddened, the maiden went off. But she was determined. She went off again into the forest to practice the words of her story, and came back the next day. But again she stumbled and mumbled, and the king, sitting there very lethargic, he did not notice what was going on. So she was sent away again. But the third day, after again practicing and practicing, she came back and was called up to tell her story. And again she mumbled and stumbled over her words. And someone from the audience said, oh, look, there she is again. And she's always with those thieves. Take her away, take her away. But just then the king came out of his lethargy, looked up and said, what's going on? And he was told, and he said, let her tell her story. And so she stood up, and words as clear as a bell came out. She said, there were a brother and a sister, and each of them was given a shofar, one of those ram's horns that are blown to call people to war, or to announce prayer, or to call down the spirits. But when they were playing with their shofars, they noticed that if one of the shofars was blown, the other one would resonate without it being blown. So they played with it. They practiced with their shofars. But then one day, the young boy, the brother, went off for a picnic with his friends into the forest. But he was very curious, and he went around and got lost. His friends came back, but he was left behind in the forest. He was afraid, and he was tired, and he was hungry. But then, when he took his satchel from off his belt, even though there were no pieces of bread or food inside, he saw his shofar, and he remembered. So he took it out and blew a long note. Immediately, the shofar belonging to his sister began to vibrate and made the sound of distress, which let her know that her brother was in trouble. So she blew on her shofar, and he responded, and with the exchange of sounds, he was able to guide his brother back home again. When the king heard this story, tears began to flow down his cheeks, and opening his arms, he welcomed in his beloved daughter. So the question that arises from this story is, what does this shofar mean for us? What is it representative of in this story? The shofar, the core. What is this shofar for us?
It's like our soul calling.